Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first lecture in the spring 2024 edition of the Lubalin lecture series. My name is Alexander. I am the curator of the Lubalin Center and one of the instructors on the TypeCulture postgraduate program. The lecture series is presented to you by Cooper Union, the Lubalin Study Center, aka Lubalin Lecture Series, and TypeCulture, which is the main entity who presents this lecture series. The lectures are built into the postgrad program. See, for those who are not familiar with the program, I will post the links in our chat. Also, do tell us where you're joining us from. But it's a postgraduate certificate program in typeface design, but also a great set of workshops and lectures that the program manages around typography, typeface design. A couple of housekeeping notes. The chat is set up. Just make sure that you're toggling host and panelists. That's a message if you want to send to the back of the house crew, so to speak. Make sure you toggle it to everyone. It's a little blue drop down above where you type the message, so make sure it's set to everyone, making sure that everyone can see the messages. The Q&A window is available. That's mainly where we'll be taking questions at the end of the talk. So if you have questions for our presenter today, do make sure to send them into that. And the talk is being recorded. If you have to take off at some point, or if you wanted to watch the lecture again, the link is available at the top of your Zoom window. If you just click the YouTube, it'll take you to the browser with that link. So save that link, and you can rewatch the lecture, or if you have to leave. It is lunchtime in New York. It may not be lunchtime in other places in the world. So if you can't stay with us, we hope you can stay through the Q&A. But if you have to leave, save the link for Zoom and then catch the talk. So I also wanted to give a huge thank you to TypeCulture for the sponsorship of the recording of this lecture. Yeah, it's helping us build out the archive of lectures in the series going back several years. So TypeCulture is an independent digital type foundry and an amazingly wonderful academic resource run by Marc Jamra. The link to them is typeculture.com, which I'll add in my multitasking ability in the chat. You can see past lectures and recordings at these two places. We have a great back catalog of lectures. So if you go to either of these links, you can find past lectures there, including this one will be uploaded into both locations as soon as we have the video recording, which will be a few days from now. So I also wanted to give you a heads up about the other three lectures that we have coming up in the spring. The first after this one, of course, the second lecture will be on March 11th in 2 weeks' time. Same time, it will be on Zoom as well. And I hope my French pronunciation will hold up. Le graphisme chez Debunking. Basically a lecture by Amelia Fontanelle, who's the curator at the RIT Carey Graphic Arts Collection, who'll focus on this really incredibly influential magazine, Arts Métiers Graphiques, which was published by the Debunking Type Foundry from 1927 to 1939, kind of an incredible artifact in the history of type and typography, a very, very important, influential piece. So don't miss that. On March 11th. And then on March 14th at 6:30 here at Cooper Union and also on YouTube, we'll have a lecture by Ellen Lupton, who will be sharing a lecture called Living with Type, focusing on the expanded third edition of Thinking with Type, and also kind of a personal story of her relationship to typography and teaching of typography, and the lecture that will close out the spring lecture series on April 4th at 6:30, called Semi-Complete, the process behind Riz de Serif and Riz de Sans, a lecture presented by Ryan Bugden, one of our graduates from the TypeCulture program, who'll be back here discussing the design of the process and in the implementation of the Rhode Island School of Design's new typographic palette. Again, that's a lecture that will be in person here at Cooper Union and will be broadcast live via Zoom. So you can register for all of these lectures I just outlined at coopertype.org/lectures. You can also take a screenshot of that QR code, and it should take you straight to that. But tonight's presentation is the true story of @ I'll talk about the now ubiquitous @ sign and sort of the complicated backstory that our guest presenter will take us through the story. And obviously, we have this talk because we have an @ in TypeCulture. So we're always very interested in knowing more, but it should be a really great insight into the history of that. And with that, I'm going to introduce our presenter of this talk, Marc Smith. Marc Smith is a professor of Latin Paleography, the history of writing in the Roman alphabet, at 2 leading academic institutions in Paris, École nationale des arts and the École pratique des hautes études. He's also the current president of the International Committee of Latin Paleography. His research work focuses on the long-term evolution of writing in the West, in its formal, technical, cultural, and cognitive dimensions. And his current project is the history of French and European writing models from the 15th to early 19th century, hopefully a topic of a future TypeCulture lecture by Marc. So we'll definitely keep an eye on that. It definitely fits very well into some of the lectures we've done and some of the stuff we cover in our program. He has lectures and taught widely in Europe and America, notably at the Newberry Library, the Getty Research Institute, and at Columbia University. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Marc. Marc, thank you so much for being with us.
Right, many thanks, Sasha. Many thanks for the introduction. I must say how happy I am to be here, happy and honored. I love the series. I was lucky enough to see one lecture years ago in the pre-COVID era, wonderful lecture by Ewan Clayton, and I've seen a few in the meantime online. So I'm delighted to be here. And by all means, if you want something on writing masters sometime from now, we can do that too. So tonight I'll be discussing the true stories in the plural of the @ sign, which we all know about thanks to the internet. Ever since the first days of email, as we all know, the @ sign has become the very icon of the World Wide Web and of modern electronic communication. And for a long time now, many people have been wondering where it comes from. We've been trying to explain in a variety of ways its origins. So I responded to a challenge some 10 years ago and gave a first lecture on the subject, which I've finally expanded and updated into a small book, which I think is not directly available in the States, which is now at least on Amazon France and other places in France, called La Véridique Histoire de l'Arobase, which means more or less the same as the true story of the @ sign. The history of the @ sign is actually a fascinating case study in paleography, in the history of writing, a field which, as you probably know, includes both the history of letter forms as such and of abbreviations. And here we're looking at both at the same time. This research, this quest for the origins of the @ sign, has taken me through multiple sources, tracking that character, that shape, through a variety of media over many centuries, from informal handwriting to expert calligraphy, from type design to keyboards, from quills to copperplate engraving, and then in type with steel punches and lead characters, all the way to typewriters and computers.
Mark, sorry for clicking.
Yes,
Your
sorry.
slides are not visible. I'm not sure.
No, I'm not. Sorry, I'm not. No, I'm not sharing them yet. They're coming up. Well, I can share the title slide if you like. That'll help. There we are. That better. Right. So the @ sign, as we know, is defined first and foremost by its universal function, mainly in our email addresses and more recently in other social media accounts, Twitter, Instagram, etc. It is defined by a specific form, which we all know, but also by a vast number of names in dozens of languages. So let us look at first at the shape itself. It's a minuscule italic A surrounded by an extended line, something like a flourish, a shape that is a kind of symbolic masterpiece, the A being the first letter of the alphabet, and the italic shape, unlike the Roman, which is more static, being a dynamic shape, which speaks of motion, speed, cursive handwriting, communication. Whoops, sorry, my battery is dying on me. Just one moment, please. There we are. Sorry for that. And so this, the line that extends all around the letter, that kind of flourish, as I said earlier, can be seen as something like a wire carrying our messages all around the world, or a network spinning and expanding ever further into space. Sorry for this rather cheesy image here. The names of the sign are mostly invented based on the form itself, and a forum of linguists some 20 years ago compiled a huge list of names. That was in the early 2000s, including the following, which I'm giving you by categories. First of all, animals. One name is the monkey, or monkey's tail, which we find in German, in Dutch, Affenschwanz in German, Appenstaartje in Dutch. Another one is the snail, which seems obvious enough, which we have in Italian, Chiocciola in Korean, in Catalan and others. Then other animals. In Danish and Swedish, it's snabel-a, which means trunk A with a trunk. In Finnish, it's miuku-mauku, the meow sign. In Slavic languages, several Slavic languages, it's not a cat, it's a dog, as in Russian sabaka or sabachka, the diminutive. In Greek, the @ sign is known as papaki, small duck, duckling. In other languages, you also have animal ears, such as Icelandic filseira, an elephant's ear, in Polish ucho świni, pig's ear, etc. So that's the first category. Second category is food. Food and especially pastry. One is Czech zawinach, which is what you see here, roll mop herrings. In Hebrew, it's strudel. In Catalan, ensaimada. There are several words in Catalan, and this is a typical pastry from Mallorca. In English, as we all know, it's mostly known as commercial A, or sometimes commercial @ which is its official name in Unicode, or more often simply @. And in most languages, at least in many languages, the local forms, which I've just mentioned, coexist with forms that are closer to English. And the way email addresses are read out often involves @ in the English form. In French, we have this weird name, arobase, which had some earlier variants, such as arobe, arabesque, and all sorts. It's now settled, we've now settled more or less on arobase. And there's been much perplexity about the origin of the word itself. It's actually very similar to the Spanish name, which is more obvious for Spanish speakers, which is aroba, and I'll come back to that presently. So only the English word at and the French-Spanish word aroba, arobas, those are the only non-descriptive names, and which thus have been taken to be possible clues of the historical origin of the sign itself. The sign is everywhere in contemporary life. It's been put to creative linguistic uses. In Spanish, in particular, it's used to render something like an A inside an O, which is both masculine and feminine. This can be read both as queridas amigas or queridos amigos, dear friends. The sign even almost became a proper noun. In 2007, a Chinese couple decided they wanted to name their baby something like at sign, which apparently in Mandarin sounds somewhat like "I love him," but they were forbidden to do so by the Chinese authorities. In France, where there are fewer constraints, at least on the names of animals, apart from the question of human names, there are quite a number of animals that have been called arobas, donkeys, a tortoise, I think, a ferret, and all sorts. In graphic design, obviously, the at sign is ubiquitous. It's something type designers have been playing with for 30 years now. Here's just a small selection of everything they've been creating around that shape, which is very different from the original shape, which in the early days of digital type design, the at sign was actually a dingbat. So you had only one possible shape. Now that it's actually part of the fonts, you can, for every font, have a shape that is that harmonizes with other letters in the font. At signs are everywhere in signs and logos. This is one sign in Paris. Logos for any firm that has anything to sell online, from real estate to love to coffee, and of course, communication services. Then we have, yes, this logo you might remember. I don't know if it's still around. This remained unofficial, this project for a logo for Atlanta, in which the at sign should be read, obviously, as at. Then artists too. Well, designers of objects first, all sorts of objects, clocks, mugs for geeks, bedside lamps, cushions, all sorts. There are hundreds of those on Amazon. You can buy just about anything in the shape of an at sign. And then finally, a few artists have also been playing around with the same shape. Larry Kagan is an interesting one. In 2005, he produced this. This is the way he works. He builds these shapes out of wires that look like nothing until you light them, and then the shadow gives you a perfect shape representing all sorts of things. And in this case, the at sign. Then we have Pedro Romero in 2010, both in painting and sculpture. Mahmoud Zenderoudi, an artist who's influenced by Arabic calligraphy, which he applies to Western letter forms. Here we have a fancy composition of uppercase V's in a border of at signs. And last but not least, well, this is the most recent one, by Guglielmo Ferraiola, a cast aluminium at sign. Finally, in 2010, that was a great moment in the life of the at sign, MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, added the at sign to its own inventory as a graphic icon of our time, a momentous acquisition, as the museum said at the time, that makes us all proud, making Ray Tomlinson, the computer scientist who sent the first email in 1971, something of an involuntary artist, and spiking also sparking quite a lot of angry comments on the appropriation of a symbol that should belong to no one and everybody. And so this much tells you why so many people might have become interested in the history of the @sign, seeing how ubiquitous it is today. Its origins are quite unclear. You can go to Wikipedia in various languages and get very different explanations from the various articles. Among those that are most widespread, these are those we need to examine. First explanation is a historical and an ancient proposition. A preposition, a Latin preposition, ad, written, it is said, in the form of a ligature between an A and a D in the uncial script of medieval monks, which is a problem in itself for a paleographer because there is no such ligature in medieval manuscripts. Second, the French preposition a, meaning at or to, with an accent. And it's been suggested that accent might be what eventually turned into an almost full circle around the letter. Then also the word at, obviously used in English, meaning at the price of, in commercial documents, in accounts and bills, invoices, since at least the end of the 18th century, and on typewriters, on keyboards, at the end of the 19th century. A second kind of explanation links the @ to something as ancient as Roman amphorae. Some say it is a sign, an ancient Roman sign, meaning amphora, being an abbreviation for the word amphora. Others say the abbreviation for Spanish aroba. The aroba being a measure of both weight and volume used in Spain for many centuries, for 800 years, from the 11th century. 1088 is the first time it's mentioned, until the adoption of the metric system in 1880 in Spain. The name itself, aroba, goes back to Arabic, the Arabic word arub, which means a quarter, since the aroba is a quarter of a hundredweight, meaning 25 pounds in weight or 25 pints in volume. And here are a few different arrobas, because the arroba varies from place to place and from date to date, and for different kinds of liquids. And so in this case, you have an arroba for wine and a half arroba for oil, which are different in various places. I won't go into the exact measurements, of course. So these various explanations have been put forward by many people with surprisingly passionate and patriotic enthusiasm. Many people have argued about places, about languages, about dates. In Catalonia, strangely enough, there's been great enthusiasm about the origin of the @sign, with many people convinced that the @sign is an essentially Catalan invention, as you see in this old page that tells you the @sign is the most universal Catalan symbol in the history of humankind. That's one page. And then on the other hand, you have many French people, together with some of their Quebecois cousins, up in arms about against any explanation that connects @ to the English word at. And so they tend to prefer the Latin explanation ad. And you get pages like this, the true origin of the @sign, or why that sign should be pronounced ad and not at. And apparently, well, some of those explanations I've mentioned apparently go back to reliable scholarship by professional scholars, essentially two, which are often cited as authorities on the question. but which have been used in such a way that the way they've been read and the ways in which their arguments have been repeated has only added to the general confusion. So let us go back to those explanations and pick them apart. The first one is add, as I said, in a medieval uncial script. That goes back to a well-known philologist from a text he wrote in the 1930s, which is Berthold Ullmann, Ancient Writing and Its Influence, which is a fine little book on the origins and the history of the Roman alphabet, in which we find this paragraph, which is essentially about typographic ligatures. This page says other ligatures still in use are AE, OE, etc. There is also, the last 3 lines, there is also the sign at, which is really for add with an exaggerated uncial D. And uncial D is the word uncial here is what has created all the confusion, because uncial is the name of a script that dates back to late antiquity and was used for many centuries in the Middle Ages. But uncial D in paleographical terms is also simply the word used to describe a rounded D with a slanted ascender, as opposed to the modern D, which we call minuscule, which has a straight ascender. So what Ullmann meant here was certainly not that ligature went back to medieval times. He was simply mentioning a D in that kind of shape, and probably thinking of a much later shape, something in between, I don't know, the 16th and the 19th century. And exaggerated uncial D probably meant something like what I'm showing now, which is from an 18th century English writing book. And so that explanation, the AD ligature, which is so popular, has absolutely no basis in history. It's just a misreading of this page. The second explanation, which caused quite a stir on the internet in the year 2000, and even in the international press, was a discovery made by an Italian scholar, Giorgio Stabile, which is a historian and philosopher, was a historian philosopher, died recently, I'm afraid. So he was a professor in Rome, and his line of reasoning went like this. The English word at, meaning a price per unit, is commercial. The historical name aroba points towards Spain and ancient Mediterranean trade. So despite the difference in meaning between a unit of measurement and a preposition at, there must have been some obscure link via the business networks of the past. And then he discovered a letter from 1536 in the book I've just been showing, Documenti per la Storia Economica, which is a classic collection of medieval business records. In this book, he found this early 16th century page, which is from a letter sent from Seville by a Florentine merchant named Francesco Lapi in 1536. And in this letter, he found the at sign you see down here, used to describe a quantity of wine. One can read here, una at sign di vino. So that letter, unfortunately, was wrongly interpreted by him in reading here una amphora di vino, considering this to be an Italian hand, the document written by an Italian hand, and looking for an Italian unit of measurement. The amphora is a unit of measurement that was used in Venice for many centuries, but this is not Venice. These are Florentines. They work with different units. The other thing is this letter is actually not in an Italian hand, it's in a Spanish hand. So this was written for a Florentine merchant in Seville by a Spanish secretary. The abbreviation he's using here is not for amphora, it's simply for the Spanish aroba, which makes this, the whole issue somewhat simpler. Another issue here is that there is a second, let's call it @ sign for now, which is at the top of the page. Here you can read addi, which means on the day. So in this case, the A is a simple preposition with a circle around it, but it represents nothing more than an A. So the problem with this, the issue with this document is that it has spurned all sorts of word interpretations, including the idea that the @ sign goes back to ancient Roman times and was the sign of the amphora. The amphora has nothing to do with this text. So, second chapter, we need to go deeper into the various stories that have started emerging, especially through this document from 1536. We must go back and take a closer look at the history of the aroba and of the abbreviations for aroba. The word aroba, as I mentioned earlier, being the origin of the French word arobase, has led many French scholars or non-scholars, just curious people on the internet, has led them to look in the direction of Spain, just as Stabile did. And the fact that the French word comes from the Spanish word is quite clear if we look at the French typographical tradition. And this is probably where the word arobase came from in the early days of the internet. Some old professionals of old French printing houses must have known the name of that sign in its Spanish form, as we may see it here, for instance, in this 1915 manual for printers, printed in Belgium, this one. We see a perfectly clear explanation of this sign as the Spanish aroba, a weight of 25 pounds. In 1926, we find in this catalogue of the de Berny and Peignot foundry, de Berny and Peignot, they were mentioned earlier by Sasha. And in this case, we find both Roman and Italic arrobas, with the interesting plural here, arrobas, which is probably where the French arrobas came from, just through a deformation of that plural ending. You may also note something special about these here, which is slightly different from the traditional English form of the @ sign. Not only do we have Roman and Italic, but we also have this little sort of ball ending moving in or out of the flourish, which we'll meet again very often, especially in the Spanish tradition. So looking at all the typographical material from France, I've been through a number of specimens and catalogues, and this takes us back as far as 1839. This is the earliest type specimen or catalogue in which I found that shape, which is the Tarbes foundry in 1839, which presents us with a Roman arrobase, no, italic. The question arises: what could French printers use this sign for? One possibility is that they actually sold it to Spanish printers, but also they might have used it for printing Spanish language material in France, and we'll see a few instances of that. Here is the earliest Spanish grammar printed in France, in which I've been able to find that @ sign. This is 1797. This is really early. It's printed in the south of France, so closer to Spain than most of the later Parisian books. The interesting thing here is the rather awkward shape of that @ which leads one to possibly imagine that character was made especially for that book, and probably maybe not very well cut. If we look at other books, other Spanish grammar books published in France, we find quite a number with the @ sign, but we also find quite a number that show us that the @ sign was not available for most printers, and you end up with somewhat weird shapes in some cases, and most often with no special character at all, just an A in brackets, for instance, or some other kind of cheap substitute. Then if we move over to Spain, there again we find a number of catalogues of Spanish type foundries in which that sign, the arroba, is not always, it's usually not part of what is shown in the catalogue itself, but you might find it, as here in Jean-Baptiste Clément, Muestras de los Caracteres from 1840. It's not part of the catalogue, it's actually part of the price list. You see here the price of one arroba castellana, meaning £25 of lead type, will cost you 275 reales. Moving back in the history of Spanish type, there again, the earliest instance we can find is late 18th century, here from the Royal Printing House, Caracteres de la Imprenta Real, 1793. Also, more or less at the same date, this different shape by the great punch cutter and printer Pedro Ifern. But you can go further back looking at books in which these characters are actually used. These books are of two sorts, unless someone else finds any others. But I've found them in arithmetic books and in Spanish grammar books again. You can use them in arithmetic in calculations involving quantities, but you can also find them in lists of abbreviations given as such in grammar books. And the earliest one I've found, the absolute earliest @ sign or arroba printed in any form of type, is this one from the 1754 grammar published by the Royal Spanish Academy, in which once again we see a character that is probably not part of the standard set, but must have been cut especially for that book. And in this case, one is led to wonder if it might have been cut in wood or something, because it might have been cut directly in copper without going through the matrix mold, etc., but just printing directly from one character cut as such, because you only need one character in that whole book, so you don't need to go through the whole process to create multiples. Then beyond the history of type design and forms cut in metal, the main thing is that this sign for the Spanish arroba was used for centuries in countless documents, which we find in handwritten form, in archives, in public and private collections. Here are just a few. This is an invoice from Seville, 1863, where you have two, and again, I don't know if it's clear enough at this size on your displays, but you can see the little hook at the end is just the same we've seen in the arrobas produced by de Bernier-Peignot. Here's another one from 1708 involving a quantity of oil. And here's a royal account from 1630 with a whole bunch of them, a whole line, a vertical line of arrobas. In every line, there's an arroba here. Here's one, a famous autograph, a letter by Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, writing to a Spanish town discussing quantities of oil he needs. And this was for a long time on the wall of a town hall in Spain at Carmona, which explains the splendid silver frame around it. And here you can see, the picture is not very good, but you can see the arroba in the text of the letter. So how far back does this take us? It takes us back more or less as far as the letter from 1536. Using this excellent dictionary of paleographical abbreviations, published not in Spain but in Portugal, but which describes forms of writing which are in large part similar to what was done in Spain. We have a full range of arrobas here, or arrobas in Portuguese, spanning the whole period from the early 16th to the late 18th century, in which you find shapes that are especially the same, but with some of those hooks and some more Baroque forms with knots and flourishes of various kinds, which gives us a whole panel of all the possible forms of that sign in the Iberian Peninsula. That's only part of the story of the at sign, or A with a flourished A, used as an abbreviation. In fact, arroba is only one of the several abbreviations which could be written in that form. And the fact that it was used for the longest time, and that the name arroba came down all the way to the 20th century, might be considered chance, considering the number of abbreviations that were used in that form, both in Spain and in other places. Here, from the same Portuguese dictionary of abbreviations, we have similar forms for anno, so something like an at sign, but with an O above. Others are used for Antonio, Antonio or Antonia. So in these cases, it's the A with the flourish plus some other element. Here's a manuscript, 1618, with Antonio down here. And these are only Spanish examples. If we move back to France, the most frequent abbreviations in France are quite different. One very frequent abbreviation from the 16th and 17th century is the word autre, meaning other, which is abbreviated, very often abbreviated as AU flourish E, and sometimes as simply as this A flourish E. That's just one example. And another more frequent use of the at sign or the flourished A alone, with nothing else needed, is a French unit of measurement, which is the aune, which is an L, which is a unit for measuring cloth. And this is a whole, several pages full of these abbreviations. One abbreviation which is used quite internationally, but especially in the Low Countries, it seems, is one we've spotted in Spain already, which is anno in dates, written as A with a superscript O, which we find here as early as 1479 in a letter from the Low Countries, and which we find again in much more calligraphic form, for instance, in Cornelis Boysen's in the early 17th century. Here's a very fine example, anno 1612. So here we need to go into some technical explanations of concerning handwriting and penmanship in the late Middle Ages. The sheer possibility of writing an A with a flourish that goes round in an anti-clockwise direction, which is what we are looking at, hardly existed. That possibility hardly existed before circa 1300, because, as many calligraphers know, when you're writing with a broad nib, you can only pull your strokes. You can hardly push them, and so you can only push these connecting strokes if you want to avoid spattering ink all over the place. And so this, what we are seeing here, what we're looking at, is a standard medieval abbreviation used both in Latin and then in all sorts of vernacular languages, which is essentially A with what is known to paleographers as a tittle or a titulus, or in Spanish, a tilde. And that essentially spells any kind of abbreviation based on A, but especially the simple syllable am or an, so A plus a nasal consonant. If you wanted to write that in cursive calligraphy, cursive penmanship in the 13th century, you would go up with this connecting stroke and then back and pull your tittle over from the left to the right. Starting in the 14th century, and I won't go into the technical details of that, but it's got to do with how the quill was cut, how it was held. It becomes possible to go the other way, to simplify the whole thing, going up and then round to the left. And that makes it technically possible to write something like an @ sign, which could not have been done before. And we find that in very many cases. Here, for instance, just one example in Spanish where we find the words pan, P-A, tittle, Juan, I or J, U-A, tittle. So that's the basic meaning of A plus that superscript line. And going back following that line, the very earliest example I've found is not Spanish in this case, but French from the eastern parts of France, from Ornans in the Franche-Comté. In 1391, we find this word ancienne written in this cursive Gothic script, which fits the story nicely, ancienne meaning ancient. And in this case, you can see precisely the technical issue of pushing the stroke that way around, because you can see that some ink spattering around on the sides of that stroke here, which are hardly visible, but tell us that there was always some slight technical difficulty in going around that way. And so the whole history of the flourished A as an abbreviation, you see, goes well beyond aroba, but chronologically takes us back as far as 1391. So that's the story of how the word aroba comes to mean the @ sign in French and in Spanish. The second lead we need to follow also takes us back to the letter from 1536 and to that word you remember at the top of the letter, in which the A just represents an A. That takes us back to Spain once again, and to something that happened in Spain in the early 15th century, so very shortly after the 1391 document we saw in France. In Spanish documents, you find a number of, well, you find these 4 signs essentially, which are an et abbreviation, so something like an ampersand, if you like, an E, an A, and an O, all often decorated with a sort of stroke on the left, which is something like a diacritic, which tells you this is a word made of just one letter. And so E is Spanish and, so semantically the equivalent of this Latin et. And the whole series seems to have derived from an idea that was built around the case of the et abbreviation. So this extra stroke was added to E and then to A and to O, and eventually the whole thing got connected by omitting the pen lift and going all the way around. And that takes us back, as I was saying, to the early 15th century. And the earliest instance I found of that is precisely in Aragon, in a small place called Daroca, in which we find a notary writing this kind of A in front of the date, at, meaning at this day of this year. And so that leads us to a second completely different series of flourished A's through a number of centuries. In Spain, this was used for centuries. Besides the abbreviation for arroba, we find this in the 15th and 16th century. And then less often, but it still appears in the in the 17th century. And from informal handwriting, as I mentioned in the introduction, we can move on to formal models given by calligraphers and writing masters. And so these are early Spanish examples of the well, in this case, the preposition a, not the arroba in the Spanish sense, printed in this woodcut, printed in 1599 by the writing master Ignacio Perez, in which you see two different forms of the a, with that flourish just meaning a. This is a Francisco, so to Francisco, etc. And this is the date, anno, año. So in this case, it's the abbreviation for the date. And from these Spanish models, we find the same letter form moving into Italian documents. So this was probably, unless I can find much earlier examples in Italy, but I don't think there are many. I don't think there are any before the 16th century. So in this case, we can see probably Italian merchants bringing that shape, that flourished a, meaning simply the preposition a, back from Spain. And this is the earliest one I've found up to now, which is written in Antwerp by an Italian merchant in 1531. And that letter a for the preposition a, meaning either at or to in Italian, is all over the place in commercial documents, especially commercial documents. Business documents in Italy are written in a specific script, which is known as la mercantesca, or mercantile script, which compared to more common forms of handwriting is especially cursive. It's very strongly ligatured, highly connected scripts. And so that leads more easily to that kind of extended flourishing. This was just one example from the Banco di Napoli, the Bank of Naples from 1620. And there again, we find examples in woodcuts and then in copperplate engraving created by writing masters as models, especially for these mercantile scripts. You never find them in any other kind of script. So there really is a business connection here. And this is the earliest one in Italy, which is earlier than the earliest Spanish one, which is by the great Milanese master Giovan Francesco Cresci. This is one of several plates in his Esemplare di più sorte lettere from 1560, where you find both an A, in which you can see here. I hope you can see my my pointer. Here we have a punto nostro, to our account. And at the end, at the start of the following line, you can see an E treated in the same manner, which is also derived from what we've seen in Spain. That's the earliest example. Then we have many more. In Marcantonio Rossi's Giardino dei Scrittori, 1598, we have several. We have a tempo, so this is the date. We have a folio, this is copying something to page 620 in my book. And this is a ragione, so that is a rate, which brings us closer to a price per unit. But you see, a is used not in a specific meaning such as price per unit, but in any kind of meaning the preposition a might have in Italian or Spanish. And this seems to have been used in Italy until more or less the end of the 18th century. This is the latest one I've found, which is in a book published not far from Venice. So in this case, we're in the north east of Italy, with a variant form with a double dash across it, which makes it look something like a crossover between the @ sign and a dollar sign. But here again, this is not about a price, it's about a date. Venezia a 1 agosto, so on the 1st of August, 1798. So that's Spain and Italy. And Spain and Italy are the two countries where these shapes were especially used. In the rest of Europe, much less so. In France, we find A occasionally decorated in similar ways, but exclusively in very sophisticated calligraphy. And this is purely ornamental. It's not something that you would find usually in business documents, where A would just be spelt A with an accent. So here's one by Jacques Ravenel, 1647, Lettres courantes à présent en usage. So cursive writing in present use. And this is another one by the famous early 18th writing master Louis Rossignol, L'Art d'écrire, where you have a double revolution A in a small size. In other countries, in the north of Europe, you find not the sign with a flourished A, but you simply find the preposition A with an accent, which might be Italian or French written in that form. And you find it constantly used in Germany, all the way from Germany to Scandinavia via the Low Countries, used for a price per unit. This is just one case in which we have the executioner of the province of Frisia sending in his bill with 3 prisoners tortured at the price of 75 florins each. 75 florins per item, an item being a prisoner. But that's what you usually find in German accounts, Swedish accounts, all over the place. You don't really need a special flourished shape to make these stand out. They stand out as a foreign word in itself. It's the Italian or French word used in that technical sense in these financial documents. And that leads us to the last chapter, which is from the old world to the new, meaning both from Europe to America and also from early modern times to the current use on keyboards and computers. So how did the flourished A sign fare between the continent and England in the first place? Until the late 17th century, at least for what I've seen, it seems that there was no real use for that A with an accent, which we've seen in other countries. It might have been because in English, the words A or to hardly need abbreviation, being very short as they are, and also maybe because of a risk of a degree of confusion between A and the English article A, the indefinite article A. If we look at this, this first writing manual published especially for businessmen by John Ayres in 1688, the tradesman's copybook, we find this plate at the beginning of the book, which has a whole collection of the standard abbreviations used by English merchants. At the top and bottom of the plate, there's a whole series with dates, measurements, units of measurement, etc. And at is not in there. So that's one piece of evidence that suggests that at was not yet in standard use at the time. When we do find something that does look like the sign, it's actually just a flourished A. This is a book of arithmetic from the late 17th century, in which we find very fancy double revolution A's, but these are simply the English article A. Here, this says of a pound, nothing more. This says of a hundredweight down here. So in this case, we see that sign used just for the article, not yet for the preposition. Until recently, I thought that I could find nothing before the early 18th century. And then something came up just weeks ago in in an auction in France, in which I found this leaf from, well, actually 4 leaves, from an English account of postage from 1698. And in this case, what do we see? We see a whole list of what are actually addresses. These are letters sent to so-and-so, to Colonel Hallett, to John Scutt. And so you get all sorts of forms from a simple A to A with something that's not quite an accent to almost full-blown at signs for ditto to Mr. Fluerling. And so this is extremely interesting because it tells us that in this case, we are not dealing with an abbreviation for the English word at which starts with an A. This is clearly the continental preposition, be it Spanish or Italian or French, a, meaning both at and to, and in this case, not at, but to. And this is the start, so as far as I know now, of the evolution of that letter form in England. It's quite clear that throughout the first half of the 18th century, there was no real standard form. The one we've just seen is remarkably similar to the modern form, but you can find all sorts in books published by writing masters of the first half of the 18th century, especially this famous collection of 212 splendid plates engraved by George Bickham, in which we have just a couple of pages written by the writing master Joseph Champion. These are from 1739, in which we find variant forms of A with something of a incipient flourish, sort of half flourish, more or less decorative. But there's just, if you look at the 5 after the A, it's just as decorated. In this case, again, it's something that should be seen more like the French or Italian preposition a, rather than an actual abbreviation. The first engraved writing models in which I have been able to find something that is perfectly identical to the modern form is this book by John Clarke, Practical and Ornamental Penmanship, London, 1750, in which we find, going back, just this little note on the side, which says Amsterdam, 35 shillings, etc., and Lisbon, 5 shillings, 6pence, 1/8 at 5 shillings, 6pence. And so that here is a rate of exchange. But again, is it an abbreviation or is it just the Italian form for the preposition a? An interesting document from that perspective is one autograph manuscript by Richard Hennessy, who was, as you might know, the founder of the famous Hennessy cognac firm, which is still based in Cognac today. And here we have a page of a little notebook that he kept in his pocket, in which he took to market, in which he noted down every day the prices at which brandy was being offered and bought at market. In this case, we have 2 different forms. We have one A, which is just a simple A with no flourish at all, in which he clearly uses meaning to. In this case, the price is 183 to 185, so that's an interval. What we see down here is different. So up here would mean 2, and down here we have something which quite clearly means at 3 1/4, which is the content in alcohol, at 180, which is the price. In addition, we also have at written out in full. This again is for a price, and you can see how remarkably similar that the shape of that T might look, how similar it might look to the actual flourish which he uses in his at abbreviation, which might be simply coincidental and very personal to Richard Hennessy, but it's an interesting case. And so from that period, from the first half of the 18th century to the whole of the 19th century and later, we find those @ signs all over the place in English business documents, in accounts, in bills. There are probably thousands in business archives in England and the States. Here's just one from a tea dealer in 1795 with a couple of very small and simplified @ signs. And that takes us again to typography. When was the earliest @ sign printed in England? Its history, it's quite separate from the aroba we've seen printed in Spain. The shape is different, as we've seen. The meaning is different. And the production of an @ sign in English type is quite independent. As far back as I've been able to go, the earliest one in England is this one in Patrick Kelly's Elements of Bookkeeping, second edition. The first edition did not have it. This was published by a printer who had just set up shop the year before and might have ordered the @ sign especially for the needs of printing this book, which deals with accounting. It has been suggested by John Lane, and I'm extremely grateful. And I'm very happy to see he's been. I saw him coming in tonight. See, he's listening on. So I'm happy to get this opportunity to thank him publicly. John has suggested that the type used here might possibly come from the type foundry of Vincent Figgins, which would provide us with presumably the first person to have cut a punch for the @ sign in the English-speaking world. And you have two here on the page. You might also notice that there's another abbreviation in that page, which is this calligraphic P, which is actually much more frequent in business documents, both handwritten and printed, and which is the traditional abbreviation for pair, PER, going back to medieval abbreviations. So much more ancient, actually, than the @ sign. And that takes us with a final leap all the way to America. Strangely enough, the first instance I've found in America is not English. It's actually in a Dutch language document from Albany in 1754. I'm not saying it's the absolute first. We probably need some more research on the other side of the Atlantic, but this is the first one I've found up to now, which is also mid-18th century. And it's also about, the shape is somewhat similar to the shape we've seen in Richard Hennessy's notebook, in which the flourish does not go all round the letter, but sort of curls up on top. And here again, we might find just as many instances of handwritten @ signs as in England. Here's just one from a fancy funeral in Washington, D.C. in 1865 with the price per unit for all sorts of things, gloves, crepe bands for people's hats, and even freezing the body down here. And so on the American side, right? Again, we might look for the most for the earliest instances of the @ sign in print, and until recently, the first one I knew about was this use of the @ sign in John Colt's Science of Double Entry Bookkeeping, 1838. Some of you might actually know the name John Colt. John was the brother of Samuel Colt, famous for manufacturing revolvers. And John Colt became unhappily famous as a murderer. He murdered his printer, which was very unfortunate. And curiously enough, paradoxically, not with a gun, but with an axe in the most old-fashioned way. But his book went through a great number of reprints by another printer, by another publisher. And so you have one instance here at the bottom of this page with, again, an A with a flourish of not that does not go all the way around, but sort of halfway around, then stops as it reaches the baseline. But just recently, I found another more slightly earlier book, which is interesting both because it's earlier, 1830, and also because the same man, this Benjamin Franklin Foster, produced not only a concise treatise on commercial bookkeeping, but also a book on practical penmanship aimed especially at business hands, in which we find writing exercises with interesting variations on A, flourishes and ligatures applied to A, but also to other letters. Here we have a sort of V at sign, together with all sorts of other highly flourished and cursive letter forms. And so here again, the at sign is especially used in business. It was used in business so much, frequently that it was also printed, for instance, on pre-printed forms for bills, as in the bill we see here, which is from the famous firm Lincoln Tea, which produced both medicinal tea and sexual pills, as you can see. And in this unlikely early encounter between the at sign and sexual pills, some of us will remember the early days of email and wading through our inboxes every morning full of spam regarding Viagra pills. The essential issue here, again, rather than just the shape itself, is the meaning of the shape, which again brings us back to questions of origin. That meaning is clarified by a few manuals, handbooks for printers, as in this one, Thomas McKellar, the American printer, 1866, which specifies that the at sign, that flourished A, means either at or to. And other sources even tell us that in America, it more often means to than at, which might suggest that the situation was slightly different in England. But I'm not quite, I don't know quite enough about that to be quite categorical. So as you might have noticed, sorry, going back just a couple of slides, the interesting thing about this Lincoln Tea invoice is that we have both the form itself that is printed. So these are type, dozen Lincoln Tea at, that's the price per unit. And then the actual price for the whole quantity, as the date and everything else, is actually typewritten. So that brings us to the earliest typewriters, which will be the last chapter, but one before computers. And so concerning the earliest use of the at sign on a keyboard, when I embarked on this research, I thought that I might find reliable answers, at least about these late technological dates in what had been raked up to now on the internet. But even there, it was possible to find some further scraps of information. So I would love to go through all these extraordinary machines which you see here, which all have at signs on their keyboards from the late 1880s onwards. The most remarkable aspect of that whole story is that you'll find in many places that the earliest keyboard with an at sign is the famous Underwood machine of 1885. And that is because MoMA in 2010, when it published its acquisition of the at sign, also gave out this kind of information. There are two issues with that earliest machine. First one is that the Underwood firm was founded a decade later in 1896. And also the second one is the first Underwood typewriters had no @ sign, even though it was already commonplace on several other machines, as I've said, from the late 1880s. And so a forum of typewriter enthusiasts had been over the question, and already some 20 years ago, had focused on the Calligraph 3 machine from 1883, which had been identified as the absolute earliest keyboard with an @ sign. Going back to the forum and discussing the issue with those wonderful collectors and enthusiasts, we managed to come up with one extra document, which is this here, which is the Calligraph Quarterly, 1882, which contains an ad for the number 2 commercial machine, which is the number 2 with a modified keyboard for use in business. And the additional characters, the additional keys that this, or the alternate keys that this machine has, are described in the ad here as @ sign, %, equal, and pound. So it seems there is no actual machine left which we can look at, but we do have this ad that tells us that this machine that came out just before Calligraph 3 already had that key. And that is where the key which was used in 1971 by Ray Tomlinson in sending the first email came from. This is the actual, well, not maybe Tomlinson's own keyboard, but the model he was using, Teletype Model 33 from 1963, in which you see the @ sign above the P, which was there because the @ sign was used not only in business, but also in coding and had been used in computers for some time. And so the first personal computers inherited these keys, the same @ sign key. Like typewriters, personal computers were largely designed for business. As you all know, IBM means International Business Machines, and the @ key was obviously a necessity in business. So the rest, starting with Tomlinson, is history. And Tomlinson chose that key apparently because he needed a non-alphabetic character that would never be part of anyone's name. And that's where the Chinese baby from 2007 almost fooled him. The @ sign had been previously used, as I said, in other coding languages for the same reason, because it means nothing itself. And Tomlinson's choice of that character, even apparently, it is said, created a few problems for some people who used that character in their own programs, because in some programs, that sign was used to erase a line of code so that the message address would self-delete when you would try and write an email. It also seems that Tomlinson probably did not even know what that sign meant, and just by a happy coincidence chose a sign that meant @ as the perfect choice for an address. So to conclude, there is no historical continuity, contrary to what has been said, between the Spanish aroba and English @ but two largely independent stories, hence the plural essentially in my title. On the one hand, a preposition meaning both @ and to, and on the other hand, the abbreviation of aroba, limited to the Iberian world, but whose name suddenly resurfaced and stuck in Spanish and French with the advent of email, but essentially because it looks similar to the English sign @. So shifts in technology, that's one interesting aspect of the whole story, is that shifts in technology contribute to defining forms of writing. If we look at the flourished A in informal writing, it has many variations, which then get standardized once it's rendered in a more formal style, first by calligraphers and then by type designers. And it's essentially after Clark in 1750 gives us that perfect at sign, and after type designers around 1800 give us a printed character for the same sign, that the shape actually becomes far more stable and leaves out all the Baroque variations we may have seen both in Spain and in England in the early modern period. So who, in the end, who does this character belong to? Does it belong to the Spanish, to the French, to the Catalans, to the English? Of course, it belongs to nobody. And on the contrary, it should be seen as the sign of the constant trade, interchange, dialogue between people, not just the exchange of goods, but also the worldwide circulation of ideas, words, and writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate the untangling of this history, which again I think reinforces for myself the idea of how messy history and how nonlinear history tends to be, and I think it's really great to go through this very detailed journey through the story of the evolution of this symbol. So thank you so much for this. I think we might have a couple of minutes for questions. I was wondering as you were talking about and in your field of paleography, I guess like the frequency of new symbols, in some ways, like that feels like the at is a new symbol, although as you clearly kind of show, it does have very long, extensive history all the way back into the 15th century, if not further. But like thinking about how our technology is evolving very rapidly, and I think the more common example is new currency symbols, in places where
Yes.
it's to be kind of a new symbology as countries develop or kind of transition out of a colonial environment and kind of become independent and create their own currency, moving away from other forms. So that's kind of the most readily available idea for me. But do you see kind of an evolution of new symbols?
Well, looking at type and at Unicode, uh, emoticons are part of Unicode that also they might seem like pictures rather than writing, but in technical terms, they're new symbols which have the same technical and a different semantic status, but the same technical status as actual letter forms in digital type. So that's one rather spectacular example. But otherwise, it's also true that many of the symbols and abbreviations we use go back a long time. Many go back, well, that P I showed, which was in use for a long time, P for pair, goes back to ancient Roman times practically. It was used in business, but had been around for 2,000 years, But yes, otherwise we're creating symbols all the time, I suppose. Currency symbols, yeah, they tend to get based on, to derive from older symbols, essentially the dollar but the dollar and the pound with their cross strokes been adapted to the yen, the ruble, and others. So it's also a way in which more recent symbols are still under the influence of longer traditions, which is also interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was also kind of curious in terms of just and I think you very eloquently kind of demonstrated like the difference between more flourished form and then kind of the more concise construction. And then there's that kind of period in the 18th century perhaps where it's a little bit more of the context of it needs to be a little bit more expressive, and so the form isn't actually the at, it's just more of kind of a decorative decision. But also kind of thinking of, I think it was the Portuguese examples of Antonio, like the abbreviation, which is, I mean, think of like, the joint that's easier is just to kind of connect to the next character, but then you sort of make this like very pronounced, kind of longer form. I was curious, like what the motivation kind of to make such a longer leap to go all the way around the character. Is it to kind of indicate like the beginning, like that sort of like a more formal A, it just seems simpler to just go to the right and connect
Yeah,
it to
yeah, it's a way of setting off the word, and that's something you can only do practically on the initial, because you wouldn't have the space around it otherwise. But in Spain, there's a lot of flourishing and a lot of connecting in weird ways, quite differently from other countries too. But I didn't go into that. But it's also a Spanish tradition, and in the Italian tradition, as I said, there is something really different in the way merchants write compared to chancery scripts, secretary scripts, and so on. And they tend to use a finer quill, which is not quite as broad or as sharp. And so their writing is much more connected. And so they tend to do these sort of whirligigs much more fluently than in other kinds of scripts. So you need to look at those symbols not only in the context of their use, but also within the kinds of scripts in which they emerge, because the technical parameters of those scripts also help explain where those shapes came from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like thinking of the context, I was thinking about how to maybe like to an uninitiated person, like the being able to parse which meaning and obviously different languages also play a role, but like given how varied some of the interpretations of that symbol could be in different languages depending on the time period, do you think is it hard? Like, is it, do you have to have, does it cause confusion or has it caused confusion, sort of misinterpretation, or is it really kind of pretty clear
Yeah.
contextually?
I wouldn't think so, because abbreviations usually work like that. Medieval and early modern abbreviations can use the same forms, same shapes for different meanings, which are usually made clear in context. There's little chance of actually confusing different different
And,
abbreviations.
and for contemporary sort of researchers, it's the same thing, right? Like it's not really complex to parse which version, what the meaning of the particular forms is.
No, if you know the language and the sort of formulaic standards of all those documents, you can usually understand clearly enough what they mean. Yeah.
And I maybe we'll take the last question, which is a question that Robin Sherman sent in about Benjamin Franklin. Like if Benjamin Franklin used it, I mean, given the history with France, of course, and then if there's any use of it in the Declaration of Independence of the Constitution.
I haven't seen any copies of the Constitution or Declaration with the @ sign in them, but you never know. You might look.
It's worth taking a look. So maybe we'll close here. I will echo Elaine. Brand asked in the chat. Thanks so much now about the ampersand symbol. So maybe that's
Oh yes. Well,
future talk we should plan.
Yeah. There,
Continue.
there was a study of the ampersand by Jan Tschichold decades ago, which was recently translated into French, and I did a postface for that.
Yeah, and there's a small.
It would be nice to reprint it in the English version. Yeah.
It has been. I don't know if it's been reprinted. I believe there's a small Velveteen Type Foundry republished that little booklet with kind of a contemporary version of kind of more recent designs.
Oh yes, that too. Yeah, there was two little volumes. One was the translation of
right.
Tschichold, and the other was new interpretations of the ampersand. That was really nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So until then, folks should look for the Chickled version and find that. But maybe that's a future talk we should plan. Again, thank you so much, Mark, for your insight, for your time being here. Really wonderful to go through this, and thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you on March 14th, or sorry, 11th, and hopefully then on the 14th. But Mark, thank you once again. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I was delighted. See you soon. Bye-bye.